Hello again. Welcome back to History Laid Bare. Consider this a time to relax, rest, and perhaps even peacefully drift off to sleep against a backdrop of calmly told stories from history. Tonight we travel back to one of the darkest times in the 20th century, a time when totalitarianism came to the fore in Germany, and the seeds of another devastating conflict in Europe had been sown. So get yourself comfortable, perhaps even make yourself a nice warm cup of tea, and we'll take a look at what life was like in Nazi Germany in one of its most pivotal years. In the winter of 1936, as snow dusted the cobblestones of Berlin's Unter den Linden, a Jewish schoolteacher named Dr. Victor Klemperer wrote in his diary, "Every day we expect to be thrown out of our home." These words, preserved in his meticulous daily records, capture something essential about Jewish life in Germany during that pivotal year. A life suspended between normalcy and terror, between routine and uncertainty. Tonight, we journey back to 1936, 3 years after Adolf Hitler's rise to power, 1 year after the passage of the Nuremberg Laws. This was a year when the noose of persecution tightened visibly around Germany's Jewish population, yet also a time when hundreds of thousands of Jewish citizens continued to wake each morning, dress for work, send their children to school, and navigate the increasingly treacherous landscape of daily existence. We will not follow fictional characters, but rather trace the authentic experiences documented in diaries, letters, official records, and testimonies. The voices of real people who lived through these darkening months. Their stories reveal how systematic oppression seeps into every corner of human experience. The morning ritual of checking new regulations posted overnight, the careful calculation of which streets were safe to walk, the weight of a yellow bench in a public park that now bore the sign, "Nur für Juden," for Jews only. This is the story of 1936, a year when the architecture of persecution became the backdrop for breakfast conversations, when state policy transformed neighborhood grocers into enemies or allies, when the simple act of existing as a Jewish person in Germany required a daily courage that most of us can barely imagine. The morning of January 1st, 1936, dawned grey and cold across Germany. In cities from Hamburg to Munich, Jewish families began the new year under the weight of laws that had redefined their very citizenship. The Nuremberg Laws, passed just 4 months earlier in September 1935, had stripped Jews of their German nationality and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. But beyond these headline restrictions lay a web of regulations that touched every aspect of daily existence. Dr. Hertha Nathorf, a physician in Berlin, discovered this reality when she attempted to renew her medical license in early January. The officials who had processed her paperwork for years now scrutinized her application with cold efficiency. Under the new Reich citizenship law, she was no longer a German citizen, but a resident of the state, a legal status that left her professional future uncertain. Her diary records the peculiar humiliation of this bureaucratic diminishment. Officials who had once greeted her respectfully now avoided eye contact, processing her forms with the mechanical detachment reserved for unwelcome obligations. In Frankfurt, the Stern family, Heinz, a textile merchant, his wife Rosa and their teenage daughter Ellen, faced similar bureaucratic erosions. Heinz had operated his small fabric shop on Zeil Street for 15 years, building relationships with suppliers and customers across the region. Now, new regulations required him to register his business under special Jewish commercial codes. The paperwork arrived with clinical precision. Forms to be filled, fees to be paid, inspections to be scheduled. Each requirement was presented as routine administrative procedure, yet their cumulative effect was to mark, categorize, and isolate Jewish-owned businesses from the broader German economy. The Nuremberg Laws had created 2 distinct categories of Jewish identity: full Jews, with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, and Mischlinge, mixed-race individuals with one or two Jewish grandparents. This bureaucratic passing of ancestry created new anxieties for families who had never considered such classifications relevant to their lives. In Munich, Clara Geismar found herself designated as a Mischling of the first degree, because her father had been Jewish while her mother was Protestant. Her marriage to a non-Jewish German was still legal under the new laws, but she now lived in a legal grey zone, subject to restrictions that could change at any moment. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of voting rights, but more immediately relevant was its impact on civil service employment. Jewish teachers, postal workers, and municipal employees across Germany received termination notices throughout January and February. The dismissals followed a standard template: efficient, bureaucratic language that cited legal compliance rather than personal animus. Dr. Ludwig Frenkel, who had taught mathematics at a gymnasium in Cologne for 23 years, received his notice on a Tuesday morning in February. His colleagues, some longtime friends, avoided conversation as he cleaned out his desk, their discomfort palpable but their silence complete. These legal changes created a peculiar form of social death, a gradual exclusion from the civic community that proceeded through paperwork rather than drama. Jewish citizens found themselves incrementally erased from public life through 1,000 small administrative acts. The cruelty was often subtle: a library card renewal that was mysteriously delayed, a professional association membership that quietly lapsed, a municipal swimming pool that suddenly required special documentation for entry. Yet within this narrowing world, many Jewish families initially sought to maintain their routines and dignity. The Rosenberg family in Hamburg adjusted their Sunday walks to avoid parks where new signs had appeared: Juden unerwünscht, Jews unwelcome. Rather than abandoning their weekly tradition, they discovered new routes through Jewish neighborhoods, creating alternative geographies of belonging within their shrinking city. The psychological impact of these legal restrictions was perhaps most evident in the letters Jews wrote to relatives abroad. In carefully coded language, for they knew their correspondence was monitored, they described their changing circumstances. "Business has been difficult lately," wrote Max Warburg to his cousin in New York, "and we are considering our options." Such phrases, repeated in thousands of letters throughout 1936, conveyed the growing recognition that their future in Germany was becoming untenable. By the spring of 1936, the legal architecture of persecution had become the backdrop for every Jewish family's daily decisions. Which shops would serve them? Which streets were safe to traverse? Which schools would accept their children? The answers to these questions changed regularly, creating a constant state of vigilance and adaptation that exhausted even as it isolated. Spring arrived early in 1936, and with it came new layers of exclusion that transformed the simple act of moving through German cities. In Berlin, the municipal government began installing benches marked "Für Juden," for Jews, in public spaces, a policy that spread to cities across the Reich throughout the year. These yellow-painted seats, often positioned in less desirable areas of parks and squares, became symbols of enforced separation that made discrimination visible to everyone. Martha Appel, a housewife in Dortmund, described in letters to her sister the careful choreography required for routine errands. The baker, who had served her family for 8 years, now kept Jewish customers waiting until all non-Jewish patrons had been served. The butcher refused to serve Jews after 4 p.m., forcing families to adjust their shopping schedules around restrictions that were often unwritten but universally understood. Mrs. Appel developed elaborate strategies for grocery shopping, visiting familiar shopkeepers early in the morning when stores were less crowded, carrying exact change to avoid prolonged interactions, and always having backup options when shops refused service. The exclusion extended to recreational spaces that had once offered respite from daily pressures. Municipal swimming pools across Germany installed separate changing facilities for Jewish patrons when they allowed Jewish access at all. The Stadtbad in Munich simply posted a sign, "Bathing prohibited for Jews and dogs." Such signs appeared throughout German cities in 1936, their crude equivalents between Jewish citizens and animals reflecting the dehumanizing rhetoric that was becoming official policy. In this environment, Jewish community organizations took on heightened importance as sources of both practical support and social connection. The Jewish Cultural League, established in 1933, organized concerts, theater performances, and lectures exclusively for Jewish audiences. By 1936, these events had become essential gathering places where families could experience something approaching normal cultural life. The League's performances in Berlin often sold out, drawing audiences hungry for entertainment that didn't require navigating the minefield of public spaces where their presence was unwelcome. Dr. Kurt Singer, the League's founder and conductor, maintained rigorous artistic standards despite the restrictions. His concerts featured works by Jewish composers like Mendelssohn, whose music had been banned from regular German performances, as well as contemporary pieces that explored themes of exile and endurance. These cultural events provided emotional sustenance, but they also reinforced the reality of separation. Jews were increasingly living in a parallel society, complete with its own institutions and gathering places. The summer of 1936 brought the Olympic Games to Berlin, creating a temporary suspension of some anti-Jewish measures as Germany sought to present a favorable image to international visitors. Signs reading "Jews unwelcome" were temporarily removed from hotels and restaurants in tourist areas. Jewish residents observed this cosmetic normalization with bitter amusement. The same shops that had refused their business for months suddenly welcomed them again, at least while foreign reporters might be watching. Yet even during the Olympics, harassment continued in neighborhoods away from international scrutiny. In working-class districts of Berlin, SA, stormtrooper units continued their practice of posting guards outside Jewish shops, photographing customers who entered and distributing their pictures as part of boycott campaigns. These intimidation tactics were particularly effective because they turned the simple act of commerce into a public political statement. The harassment took forms both crude and sophisticated. In Frankfurt, local Nazi party officials organized Jew watches, groups of party members who would stand outside synagogues during services, recording the names of attendees. They made no effort to conceal their activities. Indeed, the visibility of their surveillance was part of its purpose. Jewish worshippers had to walk past these watchers to enter their place of worship, transforming religious observance into an act of public defiance. Children experienced these restrictions with particular confusion and pain. 15-year-old Ruth Meyer, living in Vienna, which would not be annexed until 1938, but where similar restrictions were already emerging, wrote in her diary about the social isolation imposed by new school policies. Jewish students were seated separately in classrooms, excluded from school clubs and sports teams, and subjected to curriculum that explicitly demonized their heritage. The psychological impact on young people was severe. They were being taught by their society that their very existence was problematic. Jewish parents faced impossible choices about how to explain these restrictions to their children. Some families tried to maintain normalcy by creating rich domestic lives that compensated for external exclusions. Others began the painful process of preparing children for emigration, teaching them languages and skills for countries they had never seen but might soon call home. The constant vigilance required for daily navigation was exhausting. Every outing required advanced planning, which routes were safe, which shops might serve them, which public spaces they could access. This mental load was particularly burdensome for women, who typically managed household logistics and were responsible for protecting children from harassment during routine activities. By late summer 1936, many Jewish families had developed elaborate coping mechanisms. They created networks of information sharing about which businesses were safe, which officials might be sympathetic, and which neighborhoods had become dangerous. These informal communication systems became lifelines in an increasingly hostile environment, providing both practical guidance and emotional support. The observance of Jewish holidays in 1936 revealed the complex ways that state oppression intruded upon the most intimate aspects of religious and family life. In September, as Rosh Hashanah approached, synagogues across Germany faced new restrictions on their operations. Local authorities required advance notice of all religious gatherings, imposed limits on the number of attendees, and in some cities stationed police outside synagogues during services. Rabbi Leo Baeck, the leading voice of German Judaism, faced these restrictions with quiet dignity at his Berlin synagogue. His Rosh Hashanah sermon, carefully crafted to avoid direct political commentary while still providing spiritual guidance, spoke of endurance and faith in language that his congregation understood carried deeper meanings. "We are asked to find strength in difficult times," he said, words that resonated powerfully with families struggling to maintain their religious identity under increasing pressure. The High Holy Days of 1936 took place against the backdrop of the Nuremberg Party rally, which had occurred just weeks earlier. The rally's anti-Jewish rhetoric and the announcement of new restrictive measures created an atmosphere of heightened tension. Jewish families gathering for holiday meals knew that their celebrations were taking place in a society that was increasingly defining itself in opposition to their very existence. Yom Kippur services that year were particularly moving, as communities gathered to atone and pray while facing an uncertain future. The traditional prayer, "Who shall live and who shall die," took on immediate relevance as families contemplated emigration and the possibility that this might be their last Yom Kippur in Germany. Rabbi Joachim Prinz in Berlin later wrote that he had never seen congregants pray with such intensity, as if their very souls depended on these ancient words reaching God's ears. The celebration of Sukkot presented particular challenges, as the construction of temporary outdoor shelters required permission from authorities who were increasingly hostile to visible Jewish religious practices. Many families adapted by building smaller Sukkot in enclosed courtyards or abandoning the practice altogether. Others defiantly constructed their holiday shelters in full view of neighbors, asserting their right to religious observance despite social pressure. As winter approached, the celebration of Hanukkah became an act of quiet resistance. The Festival of Lights, commemorating the Jewish people's survival under oppression, resonated powerfully with families living under Nazi rule. Parents lighting the menorah with their children spoke of historical perseverance while confronting the reality of contemporary persecution. The 8 nights of Hanukkah became opportunities for families to gather privately, sharing traditional foods and stories while the world outside grew increasingly hostile. The intrusion of state ideology into religious life was perhaps most evident in the experiences of Jewish children attending Jewish schools. By 1936, most Jewish children had been effectively excluded from public schools, creating increased enrollment in Jewish educational institutions. These schools faced constant scrutiny from authorities who monitored their curricula and demanded that even religious instruction conform to state guidelines about acceptable historical narratives. At the Philanthropin School in Frankfurt, one of Germany's most prestigious Jewish schools, teachers walked a careful line between providing authentic Jewish education and avoiding material that authorities might deem objectionable. History lessons about Jewish contributions to German culture had to be taught carefully. Literature classes avoided authors who had been banned, and even Hebrew language instruction was subject to oversight from officials who understood neither the language nor its religious significance. The psychological pressure on religious leaders was intense. Rabbis found themselves counseling congregants not only on spiritual matters, but on practical questions of survival. Should families emigrate? How could they maintain their faith while hiding their identity? What religious obligations could be safely observed, and which had to be abandoned? These pastoral conversations, documented in letters and memoirs, reveal the profound spiritual crisis that accompanied the political persecution. Some families responded to these pressures by intensifying their religious observance, finding in traditional practices a source of strength and identity that external forces could not completely destroy. Others gradually abandoned public religious activities while maintaining private faith, adapting their spiritual lives to the realities of persecution. Both responses reflected the deep human need to preserve meaning and connection in circumstances designed to destroy both. The Jewish calendar continued its ancient rhythm even as the external world became increasingly hostile. Families still gathered for Shabbat dinners, still celebrated births and mourned deaths, still marked the passage of seasons through religious observance. But each celebration now carried additional weight. The knowledge that these might be the last such gatherings in their homeland, that traditions maintained for generations might soon require new forms of expression in foreign countries. The winter of 1936-37 brought particular hardship as economic restrictions tightened and social isolation deepened. Yet even during the darkest months, families found ways to maintain their spiritual lives. Children learned Hebrew songs in living rooms, mothers lit Shabbat candles behind drawn curtains, and fathers continued to pray the ancient words that had sustained their people through previous periods of persecution. The systematic economic strangulation of German Jews in 1936 proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that made it all the more devastating. Unlike the dramatic violence of earlier boycotts, this phase of persecution operated through regulatory changes, tax assessments, and administrative procedures that steadily eroded Jewish economic participation without generating international headlines. Heinrich Stahl, owner of a small clothing factory in Berlin, experienced this economic warfare firsthand. In March 1936, he received notification that his business license required renewal under new commercial regulations. The process, which had once been routine, now involved multiple inspections, special fees, and requirements that his non-Jewish competitors did not face. His factory, which had employed 12 workers and supplied department stores throughout Berlin, found its customer base shrinking as retailers cancelled contracts rather than risk association with Jewish-owned businesses. The exclusion was often accomplished through informal pressure rather than formal prohibition. Stahl's longtime suppliers began demanding cash payment rather than extending the credit terms they offered to other manufacturers. Insurance companies raised his premiums or declined to renew policies altogether. The bank that had provided operating capital for 5 years suddenly required additional collateral and charged higher interest rates. Each change, taken individually, might have seemed like normal business adjustment. Collectively, they created an environment where Jewish-owned enterprises could barely survive. Professional exclusion proceeded along similar lines. Jewish doctors found that hospitals withdrew their admitting privileges. Insurance companies removed them from approved provider lists, and medical associations quietly dropped them from membership rolls. Dr. Käthe Frankenthal, one of the first women physicians in Germany, watched her practice evaporate as patients were pressured to seek treatment elsewhere. Her medical degree, earned through years of study and sacrifice, became worthless overnight as administrative barriers made practice impossible. The legal profession faced even more explicit restrictions. Jewish lawyers discovered that courts would no longer accept them as counsel, forcing them to withdraw from cases and abandon clients who had relied on their expertise. Max Lowenthal, a prominent attorney in Munich, found himself arguing cases before judges who would no longer acknowledge his presence in their courtrooms. The psychological humiliation of this professional erasure was particularly acute for individuals who had devoted their careers to German jurisprudence. Small business owners adapted to these restrictions with remarkable creativity and resilience. Jewish merchants developed informal networks that allowed them to continue commerce despite official barriers. In Hamburg's Jewish quarter, a shadow economy emerged where kosher butchers, bakers, and grocery stores served customers who could no longer shop safely in mainstream establishments. These businesses operated on thin margins, but provided essential services to a community increasingly cut off from broader economic participation. The psychological toll of economic exclusion was severe. Men who had defined themselves through their professions struggled with forced idleness and lost status. Women who had managed household budgets found themselves calculating expenses against rapidly diminishing resources. Children observed their parents' growing anxiety about money, often without understanding the political forces that had transformed their families' economic circumstances. Emigration planning became intertwined with economic calculation. Families debated whether to liquidate assets quickly, accepting severe losses to secure funds for emigration, or to hold on to property hoping that conditions might improve. The German government had established currency controls that made it difficult to transfer wealth abroad, forcing Jews who planned to leave to accept substantial financial sacrifices. Max Warburg, the prominent banker, spent months navigating regulations designed to prevent the export of Jewish capital, ultimately losing millions of marks in assets that could not be converted to foreign currency. The impact on Jewish charitable organizations was particularly devastating. The welfare funds that had traditionally supported community members in need found their resources stretched beyond capacity, while their fundraising abilities were severely constrained. The Central Welfare Office of German Jews documented an alarming increase in families requiring assistance, while donations from the increasingly impoverished Jewish community declined sharply. By the fall of 1936, many Jewish businesses had been forced to close or sell at below-market prices to non-Jewish buyers. The process of Aryanization, the transfer of Jewish-owned businesses to non-Jewish ownership, was proceeding through economic pressure rather than legal mandate. Owners like Heinrich Stahl faced the choice between bankruptcy and selling their life's work to competitors who had previously been friends and colleagues. The human cost of this economic warfare was documented in the correspondence of families trying to maintain dignity while their material circumstances deteriorated. Letters between relatives speak in coded language of temporary difficulties and necessary adjustments, but the underlying desperation is evident in requests for loans, descriptions of reduced living circumstances, and careful discussions of emigration costs. Children from formerly comfortable families found themselves wearing patched clothes, eating simpler meals, and giving up activities that required fees their parents could no longer afford. The social dimensions of this economic decline were particularly painful in a society where class distinctions were clearly marked and widely understood. Yet even under these pressures, many Jewish families maintained their commitment to education, charity, and cultural activities. Parents sacrificed personal comforts to pay for their children's schooling, Families contributed what they could to community organizations, and individuals continued to support Jewish cultural institutions, even when their own resources were severely constrained. The year 1936 marked a turning point where economic persecution became so systematic and comprehensive that many Jewish families began to accept the reality that their future in Germany was untenable. The slow strangulation of economic opportunity, combined with social isolation and legal discrimination, created circumstances that made emigration not just desirable, but necessary for survival. Perhaps nowhere was the cruelty of systematic persecution more evident than in its impact on Jewish children, who found their world shrinking and darkening in ways they could barely comprehend. The school experiences of Jewish children in 1936 reveal how state ideology penetrated the most fundamental institutions of childhood, transforming education from a pathway to citizenship into a daily reminder of exclusion. Ruth Weiss, aged 12, attended a public school in Nuremberg until October 1936, when new regulations effectively barred Jewish students from further enrollment. Her teacher, Fraulein Schmidt, had once praised Ruth's mathematics skills and encouraged her intellectual curiosity. Now, during Ruth's final weeks in the classroom, Schmidt avoided eye contact and allowed other students to make comments about Jewish classmates without intervention. Ruth later recalled the bewilderment of watching a trusted adult become cold and distant, leaving her to wonder what she had done wrong. The transition to Jewish schools was traumatic for children who had spent their early years in integrated environments. The Samson Raphael Hirsch School in Frankfurt saw its enrollments swell as Jewish children were pushed out of public institutions. New students arrived confused and often angry, having been forced to abandon friendships and familiar routines. Teachers at Jewish schools found themselves providing psychological counseling alongside traditional instruction, helping children process rejection and loss while maintaining hope for their futures. Margot Frank, then 11 years old and living in Frankfurt with her family, experienced this transition during the 1936 school year. Her parents, Otto and Edith Frank, had initially hoped their daughters could remain in mainstream German schools, but mounting pressure and explicit exclusion made this impossible. Margot's transfer to the Jewish Lyceum represented both protection and loss. Safety from harassment, but confirmation that her place in German society was disappearing. The curriculum at Jewish schools reflected the complex challenge of educating children for an uncertain future. Teachers emphasized foreign languages, particularly English and Hebrew, while maintaining instruction in subjects that would be recognized by educational systems in other countries. Students learned German history and literature with the knowledge that they were studying the culture of a nation that no longer wanted them, creating a profound cognitive and emotional dissonance. Children's play reflected the adult anxieties surrounding them. Games of emigration became common in Jewish neighborhoods, with children role-playing the experience of leaving Germany for America or Palestine. These games served as both preparation and processing, allowing young minds to work through concepts of departure and loss that their parents discussed in whispered conversations. 10-year-old Peter Jins in Prague, which faced similar restrictions, drew elaborate maps of imaginary countries where Jews could live freely, expressing through art the longing for a place of safety and acceptance. The psychological impact of exclusion was particularly evident in children's relationships with non-Jewish peers. Friendships that had developed naturally in early childhood became complicated and often painful as social pressure mounted. Eva Schloss, then 7 years old, watched her best friend's parents forbid continued contact, ending a relationship that had been central to her young life. Such rejections taught Jewish children that their identity made them inherently problematic, creating deep wounds that would affect their ability to trust and connect with others. Sports and recreational activities, traditionally important parts of childhood development, became sources of humiliation and exclusion. Jewish children were barred from municipal swimming pools, excluded from youth organizations, and prohibited from participating in school sports competitions. The Hitler Youth, which was becoming increasingly central to German childhood experience, was explicitly closed to Jewish participation, marking these children as outside the national community from their earliest years. The response of Jewish parents to these pressures varied widely. Some families attempted to shield their children from the full reality of their circumstances, maintaining cheerful facades while privately planning emigration or enduring harassment. Others chose to prepare their children explicitly for the challenges they would face, teaching them strategies for coping with discrimination while instilling pride in their Jewish heritage. Family dynamics often shifted under these pressures. Children who had once been protected from adult concerns found themselves included in discussions about emigration, family finances, and safety precautions. 11-year-old Klaus Langer in Berlin became responsible for grocery shopping because his mother feared harassment in stores where the family was known. Such role reversals forced premature maturity while denying children the carefree experiences that should characterize childhood. The isolation experienced by Jewish children was partially addressed through community organizations that created alternative social networks. Youth groups, like the Zionist Blau-Weiß movement, provided activities, friendship, and ideological framework for understanding their circumstances. These organizations emphasized Jewish pride and Palestinian pioneering, offering young people a positive vision of their future while acknowledging the reality of their exclusion from German society. Religious education took on heightened importance as families sought to provide their children with strong Jewish identities that could sustain them through persecution and potential exile. Children learned Hebrew prayers and songs, studied Jewish history, and participated in religious ceremonies with new intensity. Parents who had been largely secular often returned to religious practice as a way of connecting their children to something larger than their immediate circumstances. The creativity and resilience of Jewish children in 1936 was remarkable. They created underground newspapers, organized secret clubs, and developed coded languages for communicating about their experiences. Their artwork from this period, preserved in family collections and museums, reveals both the trauma and the determination that characterized their daily lives. Teachers in Jewish schools documented the rapid maturation they observed in their students. Children who had once focused on typical childhood concerns now asked sophisticated questions about justice, belonging, and the nature of evil. These young minds were forced to grapple with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about safety, fairness, and their place in the world. The winter of 1936-37 brought particular hardships for Jewish children as families faced increased economic pressure and social isolation. Yet even under these circumstances, children continued to play, learn, and dream. Their resilience provided both inspiration and heartbreak for adults who understood better than the children themselves what storms lay ahead. By late 1936, German cities had developed invisible but clearly understood maps of danger and safety for Jewish residents. These mental geographies, shared through community networks and painful experience, dictated daily movement and social interaction in ways that transformed the very meaning of home and neighborhood. In Berlin, the Scheunenviertel, the old Jewish quarter near Alexanderplatz, became both refuge and trap. Jewish families concentrated there found comfort in familiar faces and kosher shops, but the neighborhood's visibility also made it a target for SA harassment and police surveillance. Mrs. Sarah Cohn, who had lived on Grenadierstrasse for 20 years, described how the character of her street changed throughout 1936. Windows that had once displayed welcoming shop signs now bore notices excluding Jewish customers. Neighbors who had exchanged daily greetings began averting their eyes. The grocer, who had extended credit during difficult times, now demanded cash payment and served Jewish customers only after all others had been helped. The creation of these internal boundaries was often accomplished through seemingly minor administrative decisions that accumulated into major restrictions. Park benches designated for Jews only were inevitably placed in the least desirable locations, under dying trees, near maintenance facilities, away from playgrounds and scenic areas. Municipal swimming pools that continued to admit Jewish patrons did so during restricted hours, typically early morning or late evening, when facilities were least pleasant to use. Public transportation became a daily ordeal that required careful planning and constant vigilance. Jewish passengers learned to board streetcars and buses during off-peak hours when crowds would be smaller and harassment less likely. They developed strategies for avoiding confrontation, carrying exact change, sitting near exits, keeping conversations quiet, and maintaining neutral expressions that would not attract attention. The simple act of traveling across the city to visit relatives or conduct business became an exercise in risk assessment and psychological preparation. Shopping for daily necessities required elaborate calculations about which establishments might serve Jewish customers and which would refuse service. Families developed networks of information sharing about friendly shopkeepers and dangerous neighborhoods. Mrs. Rosa Stern in Frankfurt kept detailed notes about which butchers would sell to Jewish customers, which bakers accepted special orders for Jewish holidays, and which pharmacists would fill prescriptions without questions or delays. The economic geography of exclusion created parallel commercial networks within Jewish communities. In Hamburg's Grindel district, Jewish merchants created an informal economy that served community members who had been excluded from mainstream commerce. These businesses operated under constant pressure. Their customer base was shrinking through emigration, while their access to suppliers and credit was increasingly restricted. Yet they persisted, providing essential services and maintaining social connections that helped sustain community morale. Children developed their own maps of safety and danger, learning which playgrounds welcomed them and which would result in harassment or violence. Jewish children in Munich knew to avoid certain parks where groups of Hitler youth gathered, while finding alternative spaces where they could play without fear. These childhood geographies of exclusion shaped young minds' understanding of their place in the world, teaching them that their very presence was controversial and potentially dangerous. The winter months of 1936-37 brought particular challenges as shortened daylight and harsh weather made navigation more difficult. Jewish families had to balance the safety that came from avoiding public spaces with the practical necessities of daily life. Ice and snow made walking treacherous on sidewalks where Jewish pedestrians might not receive help if they fell, while early darkness provided cover for harassment and violence. Religious observance required its own geographic considerations. Synagogues that had once served diverse neighborhoods found their congregations traveling longer distances as families moved to areas where they felt safer. The visible act of walking to synagogue on Shabbat, carrying prayer books and wearing religious attire, became a statement of defiance that required courage and careful route planning. Some families adopted less observant practices rather than risk the exposure that came with public religious expression. Professional men who had once moved freely through commercial districts now found themselves unwelcome in office buildings, hotels, and restaurants where they had conducted business for years. Dr. Julius Moses, a physician in Berlin, documented his shrinking professional geography as hospitals revoked his privileges, medical societies excluded him from meetings, and even medical supply companies refused to serve his practice. His professional world, once spanning the entire city, contracted to a few sympathetic colleagues and patients who remained loyal despite social pressure. The psychological impact of this geographic restriction was profound. Adults who had known their cities intimately found themselves strangers in familiar places, uncertain about where they were welcome and where they might face hostility. The mental energy required for constant navigation calculations was exhausting, leaving less emotional resources for work, family relationships, and personal fulfillment. Some families responded to these restrictions by creating rich domestic lives that compensated for external limitations. Home became a sanctuary where normal conversation and behavior were possible, where children could express opinions freely and adults could discuss their fears openly. These private spaces became increasingly precious as public life became more constrained and dangerous. The contrast between public and private life created complex psychological tensions. At home, families might maintain their cultural traditions, speak freely about their concerns, and express their authentic personalities. But stepping outside required immediate transformation into cautious, vigilant versions of themselves, constantly monitoring their environment for signs of danger or opportunity. As 1936 drew to a close, many Jewish families began to realize that their mental maps of safety and danger were toward a single conclusion. Nowhere in Germany offered true security anymore. The geography of fear had expanded to encompass virtually all public spaces, while safe havens had shrunk to private homes and a few community institutions. This recognition marked a turning point for many families, transforming emigration from a possible option into an urgent necessity. The year ended with Jewish communities across Germany sharing a common understanding. They were living in a country that no longer wanted them, where their daily movements were constrained by invisible but powerful boundaries, and where their children were growing up learning to navigate a world that defined them as permanent outsiders. The geography of fear had become the geography of Jewish life in Germany, and it was a map that pointed inevitably toward departure. As the winter of 1936 deepened into 1937, Jewish families across Germany faced a terrible clarity. The systematic restrictions, economic strangulation, and social isolation they had endured throughout the year had created circumstances that made emigration not just desirable, but necessary for survival. The daily negotiations with hatred, the careful navigation of hostile streets, the constant calculation of risk and safety, all of this had become simply too exhausting to sustain indefinitely. Yet even in documenting this darkness, we must remember the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Jewish families continued to celebrate birthdays, to educate their children, to maintain their religious traditions, and to support one another through community networks that persecution could not entirely destroy. They adapted, endured, and preserved their dignity, even under circumstances designed to strip them of all three. The voices we have heard tonight, Dr. Klemperer's diary entries, Mrs. Appel's careful letters, young Ruth's school experiences, Heinrich Stahl's business struggles, these represent not just individual experiences, but the collective memory of a community that refused to disappear quietly into the night. Their testimonies, preserved in archives and memoirs, bear witness to both the systematic nature of persecution and the persistent humanity of those who endured it. In 1936, approximately 525,000 Jews remained in Germany, down from 600,000 just 3 years earlier. Many of those who stayed did so not from choice, but from circumstance. Elderly relatives who could not travel, businesses that could not be liquidated, immigration quotas that kept them trapped. Their continued presence in Germany required a daily courage that most of us can barely imagine. As we return to our own time, these stories remind us that the erosion of civil rights and human dignity rarely happens through dramatic moments alone. More often, it proceeds through the accumulation of small restrictions, bureaucratic harassment, and social pressure that gradually makes normal life impossible for targeted groups. The lesson of 1936 is not just about the specific persecution of German Jews, but about how ordinary people can find themselves living under extraordinary oppression, and how they respond with whatever dignity and strength they can summon. These voices from 1936 call to us across the decades, asking us to remember, to understand, and to remain vigilant about the fragility of the civilization that protects us all. Well, friend, that concludes tonight's video. I hope you found some value in it. I look forward to seeing you here next time. For now, I'll leave you with the calming sound of gentle rainfall. Good night.